I'm impressed by your spirit on this rainy night. Thank you for coming out. My name is Adam Weiner. I teach in the Russian department and also in comparative literature. And I'm going to be the master of ceremonies tonight, or actually just the moderator. So this is Russia now, the current state of the former Soviet Union. I was just speaking with our guest, George Soroka, about how long I've been at Wellesley College, and it occurs to me, I think it's 31 years. And the entire time, we've had an event like this every year. It's an ancient tradition, and it also predates me. So I think we've done our best to try to keep students and the odd faculty member or two and locals from the area informed as much as possible about what's going on in Russia. At first it was the Soviet Union, now it's Russia. So I think it's a good time to point out that this is the first in a long series of Russian area study events that are going to happen this year. So if you look at your sheet, hopefully you all have one of these. You do. There's even some codes for you to use your phone on to scan them. So you can see there's lectures and performances, songs and dances, intellectual things, string quartets. It just goes on and on. And this won't be all. There will be some other events added later on. So please be aware of this and keep this in mind and attend our future events as well. Here's the poster for the next upcoming event, which is next week. Is the sound okay? Okay. That's on October 1st. So Russian style, or what twerking air cadets and gay propaganda tell us about Putin's war in Ukraine. So that should be interesting. So this is quite the fraught moment, it feels like, in terms of Russian politics and the geopolitical scene. I'm not going to express any of my own feelings about that, but I think you can all appreciate this. I hope you do. Yesterday, Russia changed its nuclear doctrine. Things feel a little frightening right now. If you look at the doomsday clock, you know what that is? It's 90 seconds to midnight. Midnight is boom. And it's never been this close to midnight. So according to the people who run that website and keep the time, it's the most dangerous moment, more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis right now. So that's something I think to keep in mind. All the more reason to listen to our panel of experts today. And I'm going to just say a few words about them and let them loose. I don't want to waste anybody's time here. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Thomas Hodge from the Russian department, the chair of the Russian department. Tom's reputation precedes him, clearly. Tom teaches Russian, the first year sequence traditionally, and yes, I saw some hands up, a victory pump or two, and 19th century Russian literature. Recently, Tom does research and writing on 19th century literature, the intersection between literature and music, and also he's kind of the premier guy, as far as I know, in this world, to write on Russian nature and hunting literature. And in fact, his last book, which won all kinds of awards, is called Hunting Nature, Ivan Turgenev and the Organic World. It came out in 2020, Cornell University Press. Get a copy soon. So Tom's going to talk about the ways the war has affected Russian culture. Is that more or less? Okay, not really. He'll tell you what he's going to talk about. Nina, you're next, right? Right? Okay. So Nina Tumarkin is Catherine Westerman Davis Professor of Slavic Studies, Professor of History, Director of the Russian Area Studies Program at Wellesley, and Center Associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. She teaches courses on medieval, imperial, Soviet, and post-Soviet history in Russia. There's a course on Russian performing arts, comparative history seminar in World War II as memory and myth, Her current book project is on the politics of the past in Putin's Russia, and it builds on her previous books, The Living and the Dead, The Rise and Fall of the Cult of World War II in Russia, and Lenin Lives, The Lenin Cult in Soviet Russia. I think that Nina's going to be talking about the domestic scene tonight. Okay. And we're very honored tonight to have as our guest a visiting lecturer, George Soroka from Harvard University. George is a political scientist. He earned his doctorate at Harvard. He's currently a lecturer on government and the executive officer of the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. His research focuses on the use and misuse of contentious historical narratives in structuring relations between Ukraine, Russia, and Poland, though he's also interested in NATO's eastward expansion, which he's published on, and Arctic politics and church-state relations in Russia. So George is going to talk, I think, about the war, the Russo-Ukrainian war tonight. So we should have an exciting series of presentations tonight. I'm going to, at this moment, turn it over to Tom. Yeah.
And thanks very much, Adam, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's going to take a second to get things rolling. Okay, yeah, good evening, everybody. Again, thanks so much for being here. It's a bit of a miserable night. And I'm afraid I'm not going to be telling a story that's particularly cheerful to cheer you up tonight. It is a fraud moment, as Professor Weiner pointed out. I am a literature person. I study Russian literature and culture, mostly from the 19th century. I do also pay fairly close attention to the music scene in Russia. So I'm very interested in 19th century music, but I'm also interested in how today's musical performers are affected by current events. I'm not going to be talking about nuclear proliferation or the large-scale political scene or the domestic economy or anything like that, but instead what I'd like to do is go back to something that I touched on last year, which is the way the current political scene impinges on the lives and actions and art of musicians. Russia, as you know, is famous for musicianship. There are many Russian artists who are some of the best in the world. I'm showing you here a slide from this time last year. Not much of this has changed. These are pro-Putin actors, musicians, a ballet dancer. These people are well known. They are people who cheerlead for Putin. Last year I talked about this amazing soprano, Anna Netrebko. I don't know, how many, just a show of hands, how many of you have even heard of her? Okay. She is possibly the finest opera singer of the last 50 years. I mean, she's really a phenomenon. And I talked about last year about her very, very shaky and I think ill-considered response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm not going to talk about her this year, though. Instead, what I'd like to do is focus on a couple of other people, because Anna Netrebko is sort of on the outs, even though she is rebuilding her career. So instead, what I'd like to do is talk about these two men. These are both musicians, two very different people. Pavel Kushnir is this man here on the left, a pianist, and as you can see, he's no longer alive. In fact, he died this summer. And a very different musician, this man here, Theodor Kurensis, who is not Russian, he's Greek, but he's Russian trained and spends a lot of time making music in the Russian space with Russian musicians. He is in fact a conductor. And what I'd like to do is offer these two musicians as a pair of character studies, or case studies, I guess I should say, who illustrate two very different paths in the tortuous navigation that needs to take place in Putin's Russia, given everything that's going on. We'll start with Mr. Kushnir. To give you some kind of a sense of what he's like, here is one of the videos you can find of him performing. This is a Chopin etude. get the idea. He was born and raised in the provinces in the little town or the city of Tambov, sort of between Moscow and Kazakhstan. Showed talent very early, comes from a musical family, graduates from Moscow Conservatory, possibly the best conservatory in the country, in 2007. He then gets further training in Yekaterinburg, and then he shows so much talent that he is appointed as piano soloist at various philharmonic societies. First in Kursk, which has been in the news recently because it's close to the border with Ukraine, and the Ukrainian counterattack was aimed there. Then in the Siberian city of Kurgan, which is way out in the middle of nowhere, kind of between Omsk and Chelyabinsk, if you know where that is. And then finally, just last year, he moved from Kurgan to the Philharmonic Society of Birobidzhan in the Russian Far East. He is a brilliant pianist. Tributes to his musicianship have been coming fast in the wake of his death. He apparently had amazing facility, could learn pieces almost instantly. I've been sort of steeping in his life over the last couple of weeks. He was a sensitive, witty man, a multifaceted intellectual, excellent writer, which I'll talk about in a second, and extremely proud of his Jewish heritage, a hard drinker, not totally unusual on the Russian scene, of course, and very much pro-Navalny. His political views we'll talk about now. Just so you understand, the move he made from Kurgan to Birobidzhan, that shows you what we're talking about. This is just the distance from Moscow to Birobidzhan in the Russian Far East. It's about as far as from Orlando, Florida to Anchorage, Alaska. Why did he move? Well, because Mr. Kushner has been a very vocal political activist for liberal causes his entire adult life, and he was starting to get forced into performing at patriotic concerts in Kurgan that he didn't want to perform in. So he put out his resume, and Birobidzhan in the Far East just snapped him up. So he took part in the protests on Bolotnaya Square against the corrupt elections. Those protests roughly from 2011 to 2013. He, of course, protested the annexation of Crimea by the Russians in 2014, as I say, and then later the war in Donbass. He was on the streets protesting in 2018. He was so disillusioned by the seizure of Crimea that he sat down and created a novel, 235 pages long, using the so-called cut-up method. And I don't know if any of you are students of 20th century literature, but a cut-up novel is a novel that the writer creates by taking previously existing texts and then scissors and snipping out bits and pieces of text and words and then rearranging those into a new narrative that says what the writer wants it to say. His novel, created in that method, is called Russkaya Narezka, or a Russian cut-up. And you can see the sources that he used, and it has been acclaimed by as great a poet as Olga Sidakova, which is really saying something. I read a few pages of it. I'm not going to pretend that I read the whole thing, and I thought it was actually brilliant. The few pages I read I thought were amazingly well done. He was a very outspoken activist. You can see a sort of snapshot here of his leafleting techniques, which were very carefully thought out, anti-Putin, anti-fascist, as he put it, leafleting that he undertook in the city of Kurgan. He turned from leafleting to hunger striking after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And here he is on Vkontakte, the Russian Facebook equivalent, announcing his first hunger strike, which was May of last year. After he was hired to be the soloist with the Birobidzhan Philharmonic in 2023, it became clear that he was an interesting interview subject. And so there are a few local news interviews with him, on local television news interviews. This is one of them. This was an interview that he did in 2024 where he's banging away at an out-of-tune upright piano. This person who's sort of the level of skill that could make him an international touring soloist, but there he is in this grubby little room, shooting B-rolls for this local television station. And the interviewer, during this 10-minute interview on the news channel, asked him how long he wanted to be there in Birobidzhan. And he said, "I hope to stay and work here for 12 years if they don't throw me in prison, draft me into the army, or fire me." Well, Mr. Kushnir was the consummate nerd. I mean, this is somebody who composed serious poetry in the Navi language, the constructed language from the film Avatar, and all sorts of other things that were, he was an X-Files fanatic, and so he created a YouTube channel, a YouTube account called Ina Agent Mulder, and that is Special Agent Mulder, and it was not exactly a going concern. It had 5 subscribers as of this January. And what you're seeing there is one of the videos that he posted on his YouTube channel. And he calls this video Reason, Life. That's all he calls it. It's less than a minute long. Part of what he says is written at the bottom. The Bucha massacre is a disgrace to our homeland. Fascism is the death of our homeland. Putin is a fascist. The peoples of our country gave gave millions of their best lives so that there would be no fascism. We will not accept it. We will not worship the beast. Down with the war in Ukraine. Down with the fascist Putin regime. Freedom for all political prisoners. And of course, Navalny was still alive at that point, so he's talking about Navalny probably first and foremost. Freedom for all prisoners in general. Freedom for everyone. So this nerdy, brilliant, genius man, this pianist, crossed a line that he shouldn't have crossed. And this is how he ended up when he died after a dry hunger strike on July 27th of 2024. A dry hunger strike is where you refuse liquids as well as food. And this is a snapshot taken by one of the only 8 people who attended his memorial in the city of Birobidzhan. So you can see how things went for Mr. Kushnir. I think he was 39 years old when he died. Descriptions of him by his friends, which, as I say, have been just effusively extolling him as a human being, have stressed the way he was morally uncompromising. So he was an uncompromising person when it came to morality. Let's talk about the other musician. And I chose that photo deliberately because Kurensis is a sort of rule breaker in many ways. And he frequently, he's changing now, but he frequently conducted in sleeveless t-shirts and did all sorts of other things. Let's get a sense of his personality by looking at a quick clip of what it looks like when he conducts. This is just last year with his own orchestra, Musica Eterna, it's called. This is part of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, second movement. Notice something strange about the orchestra? They're standing. All of the instrumentalists who are capable of standing, not the harpist, for example, but everybody else is standing. This is one of the kind of norm-breaking procedures that he has adopted. It's not uncommon in period instrument and small ensembles, but for a full-size symphony orchestra to do, it's kind of strange. Other things he does that break norms. Apart from the way he dresses and presents himself, he walks around sometimes among the musicians as he conducts them. He gets down off the podium. He's not a Russian, he's Greek. He spent his 20s in Russia studying conducting. He became the principal conductor of first Novosibirsk, then later the Perm Opera and Ballet Theater. He founded, while he was in Novosibirsk, this orchestra that I mentioned called Musica Eterna. It's a very good orchestra, composed pretty much entirely of Russian, Siberian musicians. He was married briefly to a pretty famous prima ballerina of the Mariinsky Ballet, Makhalina. She said it was a mistake, and it lasted, I don't know, a year or something like that. Details are hard to find, but I saw an interview with her, and she shook her head and said, "Oh, such a mistake." And she went on to talk about his music. Kurensis became such a phenomenon on the Russian music scene, performing in Russia, that he was awarded, by decree of President Putin in 2014, his own Russian passport to go with his Greek passport. In 2017, he began a long association with possibly the world's most important music festival, which is the Salzburg Festival in Austria. And he then became the chief conductor of the Southwest German Radio Symphony Orchestra. So these are important posts. This is how the New York Times describes him. Kurensis is the rebel maestro of classical music. Tall, lanky, and boyish, with pierced ears and dark hair. He's been described as a punk, a goth, and maybe we can slip emo in there, I don't know, an anarchist and a guru, all of which have elements of truth but fail to convey the blend of talent, charisma, and energy that has swept him from the periphery of the music world to its most prestigious stages. I mean, he is really red hot in classical music today. Here is an example of him taking a moral stand. This is 2017, when Kirill Serebrennikov, who is a pretty much openly gay theater director, and that's worth mentioning because in Russia it is illegal to propagandize gay culture. LGBTQ culture cannot be in any way sort of spread or disseminated or popularized. That is actually against the law in Russia now. The authorities went after Serebrennikov, on what seemed to be trumped up charges of embezzlement, and Kurensis, who was a good friend of his, there's a photo of them together, stood up for him and defended him publicly on the website of the Pierre Theater of Opera and Ballet website. So what's the problem? What's going on here? Well, there are a number of problems with this conductor, Kurensis, that make him a controversial figure. Problem number one is sponsorship. His main sponsor for the Orchestra Musica Eterna is VTB Bank. This is a state-owned bank. It has been sanctioned for participating in the financial support of the war effort against Ukraine. You can read salacious details, or not salacious details, but details of the corruption of its president, a man named Kostin, Andrei Kostin, who is sort of a textbook corrupt Russian oligarch, ultra-rich, ultra-corrupt. It gets worse. The sponsorship also includes board members of the Musica Eterna Cultural Initiative Support Fund, one of whom happens to be Alexander Beglov, who is the governor of St. Petersburg and a Putin crony, who also has been sanctioned by the United States. And then there's Elvira Nabiyulina, who is governor of Russia's central bank. She too has been sanctioned by the United States. So financially, Kurensis is in bed with some fairly unsavory people, at least from the point of view of the West. Problem number two, his silence on Ukraine. So as one of the most visible music makers in the Russian space, he has been completely silent, at least verbally, about Ukraine. And for this he was denounced by Oksana Zymiev, who was a very important up-and-coming young Ukrainian conductor who was scheduled to appear in a festival with him. And she said, I am not going to drag 150 of my musicians from Ukraine being attacked by Russia to be on the same stage with Theodor Kurensis, because he won't come out and say that this is an atrocity that's being committed in my homeland. And then finally, problem number three is his timing. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine took place on Kurensis' 50th birthday, which was on the 24th of February 2022. And that day he led, sort of narcissistically, a birthday concert, even though the invasion was underway, consisting of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And then a couple days later, he led the Beethoven's Ninth, again, you heard an excerpt from it, for a concert in Moscow with more than 1,500 people. And it just this rubbed everybody the wrong way, and the postponements started. And people have been asking him to say something explicit about Ukraine, and he just won't do it. So what is his response? His response is form a new orchestra that is not Musica Eterna, that is not sponsored by VTB Bank. And this one is called Utopia, and it too is a superb orchestra. He has managed to excite and attract an all-star list of musicians from various other orchestras in Europe. And if you're interested, you could fly to Germany today, and I think tomorrow they're performing Bruckner and Mahler alternately in Berlin, Baden-Baden, and then Hamburg, and then on from there. I mean, he's just on an upward trajectory. And you know, what I would say about him, about Theodor Curensis, is that, and you'll see this if you read profiles of him, and oh boy, there are lots of profiles, and oh boy, there are lots of slick videos, way slicker than any videos you can find about Pavel Kushnir. Curensis is constantly described as an uncompromising musician. And I would suggest to you that what we have here are two alternate responses to the reality facing the music world right now in the Russian space. Pavel Kushnir is not a charismatic person. If you don't believe me, you can watch a few interviews with him. He's a lovely guy, but he doesn't exude charisma from every pore of his body the way Curensis does. This guy is really something. Kushnir seems to be someone, if we kind of come up with a binary typology of him, he's willing to make musical compromises, but no moral compromises. And if you had to kind of put a label on him, I suppose you could call him a dissident in the old school sense, or even a martyr now, given the way things have turned out for him. Curensis is not dead, he's still alive and thriving. He has figured out a way to sort of maneuver and just prosper in an otherwise politically fraught environment. He's a charismatic pragmatist. He doesn't make musical compromises. He keeps his musicians rehearsing for 10 hours beyond the time they're supposed to stop. There are legendary stories like this about him. He does seem, however, willing to make moral compromises, if not aesthetic compromises. And his detractors call him a careerist. I'll wrap up by leaving the last word to Olga Shkrigunova, who's a good friend, also from Tambov, grew up with Pavel Kushnir. Here's what she says about him. In the wake of his death, she wrote, "I tried to persuade Pavel, especially when he was looking for a new place to work a year ago, to come to Germany, the way she had emigrated to Germany a long time ago now, back in 2012. Pasha was just an incredible person," she says. "Ever since he was a child, everyone talked about his incredible ear for music. For me, he was always a genius, both as a person and as a musician. A genius is an idealist who brooks no compromise, who battles on behalf of love, creativity, and freedom." I'll leave you to ponder that definition and yield the floor to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. So our next speaker is Professor Nina Tumarkin, and I just wanted to point out that I'll field questions after all the speakers are finished. Nina?
Can you hear me if I just speak like this? It's a small room. Well, I'm delighted to see you all here, familiar faces, unfamiliar faces, daddies, mommies. It's great. I'm especially pleased to welcome Dr. George Soroka, who just left for a moment. Reading our press, you would think that in the past year, this war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, the special military operation, you're not allowed to call it a war, that it has been, it's slogged on relentlessly for 2.5 years. Reading our press, you'd think that it has been on the forefront of everyone's minds in Russia. In fact, people are mostly concerned, I think, with their families, their jobs, their income, their material living conditions, their social security prospect, the war, and the consequential dramatically increased authoritarianism and domestic repression have had a mixed impact. I want to say a word about the word repression. That's a code word Russians use for persecution, even to the extremes. So they'll talk about Stalinist repression. I mean, so that's serious repression, millions dying in the Gulag. So the question is, how does one live in a country that has unleashed and is pursuing an aggressive war against one's nearest neighbor? How to make sense of it? The government makes it possible for many people to actually almost ignore the war, which has in 2.5 years killed over 70,000 men. Now put that into perspective to compare this figure to the 58,220 men that the United States lost over the course of 10 years in Vietnam. This is in 2.5 years. According to the most reliable polls that we have, and we do have some reliable polls, a bare majority even follow the war even somewhat closely, with 47% reporting that they pay little to no attention to it at all. Men and older people are the ones who devote most attention to it, and they get most of their information from television, which of course is controlled by the Kremlin, and it is still the main source of news in Russia. The majority of people get their news from television rather than social media, the internet, other sources. Do people support President Putin's war? The answer is mostly yes. Most recently, at the end of August, 78% of people polled said that they support or somewhat support, quote, the actions of the armed forces in Ukraine, which is how the question was phrased. That support is highest among men, especially older men, and among those who get their information from television. 88% of those people support the war. Why? Why do so many people support this war? Let's look at some of the reasons. First of all, the television coverage minimizes the war and certainly does not dwell on setbacks more than necessary or on casualties. Many people also approve of Vladimir Putin as president. There's no doubt about it. Although the percentage of people who think that Russia is headed in the right direction has fallen from 75% in June to 67% in August, which is likely due to Ukraine's August offensive in the Kursk region of southern Russia that shocked many Russians. Still, Putin's approval rating remains very high at 85%. Compare that to President Biden, right? So many will support his actions and his initiatives because they support him. Putin's original goal in 2022 to, quote, denazify Ukraine, which he compared to Germany in World War II, gave way rather quickly to claims of defending Russia from the existential threat posed by the West, especially the United States, which aims to destroy Russia. The Kremlin is portraying this as a proxy war with the West and particularly with the United States. And this besieged fortress mentality resonates much more effectively than did the idea of ridding the Ukraine of purported Nazis. The special military operation is also strongly supported by the Russian Orthodox Church, which showers it with blessings. This past April, the Russian Orthodox Church issued a document that included the following statement, and I quote, "From the spiritual and moral point of view, the special military operation is a holy war. in which Russia and its people are defending the single spiritual space of Holy Russia. Pope Francis warned Patriarch Kirill to avoid becoming Putin's altar boy. That's the phrase he used. There's an element, too, of protecting Russia, the church is very big on this, as is the Kremlin, from being weakened by Western, quote, decadence. That is to say, in the West, the acceptance of homosexuality, of non-traditional families, of transgender status, and all the rest. In 2020, a new and grand cathedral of the Russian armed forces, the Cathedral of the Resurrection of Christ, was opened, dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the 1945 victory over Germany. And this photograph, which I chose for the poster, I found it in the New York Times, is of military recruits in that very grand cathedral. And it was symbolically completed on Victory Day, May 9th, 2020, and opened on 22 June, which is the day, quote, Day of Remembrance and Sorrow, the anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union by Germany in 1941. And references to the USSR's 1945 victory, which are largely recast as Russia's victory, rather than the victory of all peoples of the Soviet Union, abound in rhetoric and symbolism in this Russo-Ukrainian war. And then there's the idea on the part of many that they're loyal to their country, and since the country is at war, they naturally want it to prevail and be victorious. But it's a very important salient fact that I discussed with the students in my Putin seminar, like Maggie, that the popular support for the war tends to be rather passive, rather than, as opposed to ardent. And that's really what the Kremlin wants. They do not want hardline, ultra-nationalist social pressures to wage war more effectively, as has been the case, for example, in Israel. And as did this very famous Mr. Prigozhin, who staged a coup because he thought the Ministry of Defense was mishandling the war, and then, of course, the coup failed, the coup withered, and then he himself was killed shortly afterwards in an airplane crash. I'd say that people are, their support is a rather kind of acquiescence to what is. I'd say they're mostly anti-war. You know, they're against people who are against the war. But there's really little enthusiastic support. The Kremlin's goal, effectively, is to have people believe that Putin is right about everything, and to make sure that people don't get involved in politics. That's been the get-go. More importantly, do Russians want this war to continue, or are they eager to see their country start peace talks? Keep in mind that when pollsters ask this question and Russians read the words peace talks, they mean peace talks on Russian terms, which would include, of course, keeping Crimea, keeping the Donbass, the eastern parts of Ukraine, perhaps other areas that the Russian army has occupied. But still peace talks. And here the striking statistic is the huge difference between how men and women answer this question. I think you can guess the answer. Almost twice as many men and women want to continue the war rather than to start peace talks. And of those, it's mostly men over 40 who are too old to fight who take this position. The young people, the age of our students here in the audience, people ages 18 to 24, the age to be called up in a mobilization overwhelmingly want to move on to peace talks, which is understandable. There was a partial mobilization or draft launched exactly 2 years ago in September of 2022, which led to panic and widespread anxiety. also to the rapid emigration of at least 200,000 men of military age. So those who mostly fight, or who fight, are mostly soldiers on contract who do it for the money. Military salaries are very high. Indeed, in many parts of the economy, salaries are very high. Russia suffers from an acute labor shortage. There's very little unemployment, and there's a fierce competition for workers. So for example, for a qualified welder, the salary has quadrupled since the start of the war. Which brings me to a question actually of Russian demography. This labor shortage is a reflection of the country's shrinking population, which is also an aging population. Putin has expressed concern about this for years, and especially about the decline in ethnic Russians, who make up some 70% of the country's population of 146 million. The most recent United Nations projections are for the world population to decline by about 20% by the year 2100. But the estimate for Russia is a decline of 25 to 50%. And Russia's natural population growth has been curtailed by military casualties, by emigration, by a widespread reluctance to have children. And the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 added 2.4 million people to Russia's population, but it significantly reduced immigration into Russia from Ukraine and Moldova for obvious reasons, right? So the emigration by hundreds of thousands of young men to avoid the fighting and an unknown number of women is reducing the already small cohort of Russians in their prime reproductive years. And of course, hundreds of thousands of men being sent to serve in Ukraine further limits reproductive potential. Many Russian women have increasingly opted to avoid pregnancy in the face of economic difficulties and growing uncertainty. And Russia is not experiencing a major influx of new immigrants or returning compatriots. The full-scale war has further limited the already diminishing prospects of inducing a larger share of the 30 million Russians living outside Russia to return home. The economy is fairly stable, largely but not solely, due to Russian exports of energy, which gives Russia the reserves to fund all these high salaries. And that said, Russia plans to drastically increase its defense spending to an historically high figure. Defense and national security will account for 40% of total government expenditures in 2025, surpassing the combined allocations for education, healthcare, social policies. But now life mostly goes on as normal. It's certainly true in Moscow. People do not mostly go around from day to day worrying about how bad things are. If you're a Moscow intellectual or business person, you can still travel. There's no feeling that you're going to be locked up at any moment unless you protest the war. Overall, I would say the mood appears to be calm, although anxiety levels spiked in the past few weeks with Ukraine's military incursion into the Kursk region of Russia. But this previously authoritarian government has slid into outright autocracy and is extraordinarily harsh on dissent or even the slightest critique of the special military operation, even symbolically. Of course, the death of Alexei Navalny on February 16th in an Arctic penal colony was a particularly bitter event. There was a publicized prisoner swap on August 1st that many of you read about. They caused Russia to release 16 people. That was wonderful. But over 1,000 people were criminally charged for activities deemed as protesting the war. Hundreds and hundreds of people are languishing in jail. And all of this kind of harsh repression of any kind of dissent began about a dozen years ago in 2012. Then a sentence of 3 or 4 years was considered long. Now the normal sentences are 10 years and more. Alexei Navalny was serving a term of 19 years. Vladimir Karamurza, a major activist, was charged with treason and got a sentence of 25 years. These are terms like you had in the Stalin era, not even in the Brezhnev era. On another front, at the beginning of this war, the decision of the Russian Supreme Court to ban the international LGBT movement as an extremist organization entered into force, and Russian courts began to massively fine and arrest people, even for publications depicting a rainbow. I'm determined to end this presentation on an upbeat note. So I'm going to conclude with some words about Russia's anti-war movement, which does exist after a fashion, even though many in the West ask why Russians aren't protesting the war en masse as they should be. What's wrong with Russians? We did this during the Vietnam War, why aren't they protesting? The anti-war movement does not look like Western-style protests with young people marching, holding up placards, speaking through bullhorns. Russians have to be driven to a type of resistance that's more subtle and nonetheless powerful. Russian protests began on the very day of the invasion, February 24th, 2022. People went into the streets in more than 50 cities throughout the country. Police brutality was immense. On that one day, February 24th, 1,974 people were detained. People still took to the streets. Record numbers were detained, beaten, humiliated. And over the first 2 weeks of protests, at least 14,900 people were detained in over 100 cities. And some hundreds of them were minors. The protests brought no change. But a lot more repression. So the protesters began searching for alternative methods of protest. They will stand in solitary pickets holding up signs, knowing they will be detained. Others post on social media. Others use graffiti. Often these are people in the provinces or young people who are not fully aware of how risky to themselves their actions are. Russians donate to the Ukrainian military and aid programs. They aid the millions of Ukrainian refugees inside and outside Russia. The ramping up of this mass repression means that some of those who were able to stay apathetic no longer can afford to do so. Activists are popping up throughout Russia, and it's no longer just Muscovite youngsters, but people from rural Russia, factory workers, policemen, teachers, and more. And their average age actually is 38, which is rather old. So the question we need to be asking is not why Russians aren't protesting. We know they do. But why are Russians protesting despite the horrendous threats that they face? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tumarkin. And now our guest speaker, Professor Soroka.
Well, thank you everyone for showing up for this important talk. I'm really heartened by the people who went in front of me, so Professor Tumarkin, Professor Hodges, because I think our talks have a lot of resonances, a lot of similarities. What I'm going to emphasize today, what I'm going to talk about today is the war in Ukraine, but I'm not a military specialist, so I'm not going to talk about the day in, day out maneuverings of the front line and of the troop movements. I'm going to talk more about the war in Ukraine and contextualize it in the context of Russian foreign policy, and specifically how Russian foreign policy has changed over the last decade plus in pretty profound ways, both leading up to this war and since then enabling this war. And what I really would like to have you keep in mind as a framework for the talk is the war in Ukraine, as you heard Professor Tumarkin say, and I agree wholeheartedly, is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. At least the Russian elite doesn't perceive it this way. It's a proxy war with the West. And I think this is where we fundamentally made a mistake in predicting this war, or not predicting this war, as many pundits, as many observers in the West failed to do. Many of us failed to understand exactly what the Kremlin saw this conflict as. So that's maybe the most important takeaway. The framework for the talk, though, I'd like you to keep in mind, if you would, is, first of all, Russia's changing geographic focus in its foreign policy. And along with that is the growing civilizational element in its foreign policy. So I'm going to give you some numbers. My numbers are a little different than what Professor Tumarkin gave you, which I think speaks to the fact of how difficult it is to actually get good evidence, good data about this conflict. But we have 2.5 years of war, shows no signs of abating. Russia, if anything, has militarized its economy. It's gone on a war footing this year. 6% of the total GDP of Russia is going to be spent on military-related expenditures. This is more than spent on education, more than spent on social welfare programs. This number is only going to increase in the future. What the downstream effects of this will be, we'll have to see. They will probably be pretty monumentous. There's no way the ruble won't be devalued by this eventually. But where we are right now is a point in time where the Wall Street Journal just reported last week that we have exceeded 1 million casualties between Russians and Ukrainians in this conflict, these 2.5 years of warfare. The estimate from Western intelligence agencies, quoted in the Wall Street Journal, is about 600,000 Russian casualties. Of those, about 200,000 killed in action. And that's actually a believable estimate because it actually lines up with well-attested figures that for every 3 or 4 people injured in combat, you have 1 fatality. These figures have held fairly consistently since the late 19th century through World War II. It's changed a little bit now in the US Army, for instance, where we have better equipment. It's actually more now like a 1-to-10 ratio, but this is not what we're talking about in Ukraine and Russia, right? We're talking about generally ill-equipped troops. The Russian estimates are astounding. There's just no other way to put this. The Ukrainian estimates, though, are also quite shocking. The estimate is 80,000 killed in Ukraine, 400,000 wounded. And again, this roughly corresponds to this 1-to-3 or 1-to-4 ratio that's been fairly well accepted for a number of years. All right, so there's no way of getting around this. Putin badly miscalculated in his invasion of Ukraine. In February 24, 2022, by all intents and purposes, by the looks of it, he expected a short, successful war. The column that initially advanced on Kiev of armor made no attempt to camouflage itself. It went down the main highway. All indications are that he expected to be welcomed with open arms. Indications are that they thought this would take about 3 days. This is one of the problems that authoritarians have in waging military campaigns. People are afraid to tell them anything besides what they think the dictator wants to hear. Finland, my map's a little outdated. Finland joined NATO, as we know, in 2023. Sweden joined earlier this year. If Putin's goal was to keep Russia safe from NATO, if Putin's goal was to keep Ukraine from joining NATO, I want to suggest to you that he had exactly the opposite of his desired effect. He effectively increased Russia's border with NATO by doubling it. Finland added 1,340 kilometers. That's now NATO territory to the border. It also fundamentally restructured the geopolitics of the region. With Finland and Sweden joining, what's going on in the Baltic Sea has fundamentally changed, and what's going on in the Arctic has fundamentally changed. Why the Arctic? Well, Murmansk, home of the Northern Sea Fleet. 2/3 of Russia's nuclear capacity is concentrated in the Northern Sea Fleet. Russian military strategy relies on the Northern Sea Fleet and specifically protecting the Barents Sea up there at the tip of Norway for maintaining its second strike capacity. But as I told you, it wasn't just Putin who seems to have badly misestimated or misunderstood what would happen. Western observers did as well. And again, I want to suggest to you that many people in the West seem to have misunderstood that this war would even happen or how it would unfold, because they failed to understand that this was fundamentally seen by Putin and cronies as a proxy conflict with NATO and the West. So again, two sides to this. I want to suggest to you today a civilizational appeal to the uniqueness of Russia and its role in the world, and a concomitant geographic recentering of Russia's foreign policy priorities in the last decade or so. Before we discuss this at the 30,000-foot level, though, let's look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. So this is from the Institute for the Study of War. This is as of Monday. These are the current front lines, or were as of a few days ago. Basically, the war has, except for the incursion into the Kursk region of Russia by Ukrainian troops, has essentially hit an effective stalemate. Again, the incursion into Kursk was unexpected. It made some Russians at least sit up and notice the war had come home in a way. The reason for this, a lot of people in the West, a lot of military strategies kind of preclude this offensive. Oleksandr Syrsky, who's Ukraine's commander-in-chief, claims this was done because Russia was planning to launch a large-scale offensive from that region. Whether this is the case or not, we're not entirely sure, but certainly it had a very profound psychological impact on Russians who were watching this. The big problem, of course, is that right now, to effectively advance the front lines, to regain territory, Ukraine needs to hit further into Russian territory. A lot of the attacks, the missiles that are being launched into Ukraine, are coming from further geographically than Ukraine is able to hit with its current munitions and with the shackles that have been put on it by the West, and particularly the United States. So as you know, if you've been following the news, right now, President Volodymyr Zelensky is going around asking world leaders, particularly US leaders, to let them hit further into Russia. Putin has come out and said yesterday that he's revising the nuclear strategy. He's said openly that if the West allows this, he's going to consider the war as having expanded to be a war between Russia and NATO. No longer a proxy war, but a direct war now. We'll talk about this in a moment. This is actually not an entirely new development. The 2023 Russian foreign policy concept has already fundamentally reshaped Russia's military posture. It just hasn't been widely reported. Although Putin's comments from yesterday are the most overt in terms of having a major world leader threaten nuclear annihilation. So again, what got us to this place that we're thinking about doomsday clocks again, and we have the leader of the largest country in the world threatening the West. Western leaders trying to decide whether it's worth facing him down and giving Ukraine free rein to go longer into Russian territory. You know, I had the pleasure of talking to Boris Yeltsin's first foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, some years ago. And he said, and this really stuck with me, that the West kind of treated Russia like Rip Van Winkle. Soviet Union fell, and we assumed that Russia was on this nice trajectory with bumps, you know, but it was basically going to be democratic, and then when it became clear it wasn't going to be democratic, it was still a potential partner. We didn't take it seriously, in other words, right? Attention focused to East Asia, particularly China, for obvious reasons, but the point is that in 2010, NATO's security concept was still talking about Russia as a partner with whom relations should be deepened. So less than a decade and a half ago, China wasn't even mentioned in the security concept. In NATO's latest iteration of the security concept, so the 2022 document, Russia is talked about as the single greatest threat, along with China, to the West. Not only because of rising military tensions, and China's rising military power, but also because they fundamentally challenged the values of the West, liberal values. So what you see here is a quote from Valery Gerasimov, who's the head of the general staff of the Russian armed forces. He's basically the guy in charge of the Russian military. This is what Mark Galeotti, a very good observer of all things military in the region, has called the Gerasimov doctrine. But basically, Gerasimov here is arguing that we have now a new form of non-kinetic, basically permanent warfare. He advanced this in 2013, right? Non-kinetic means not firepower. He's saying that war has taken on different dimensions. War is being conducted by means of propaganda, by means of social media, by means of extrajudicial assassinations, and so forth. And what I want to suggest to you today is that one of these means of conducting war by other avenues, if you will, is to focus on civilizational issues, to focus on ontological security, and to focus on tendentious, selective historical justifications for policy preferences, for policy actions. There's a lot more going on here. We know Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential election. We have inklings that they're interfering in the current presidential election. We can talk about that, right? We've known this for a while. Facebook, while it was still Facebook before becoming Meta in 2017, put out a really interesting white paper that in great detail walked through Russian influence operations and Chinese influence operations in the United States and the Western world as well. We also know, for instance, that Russian propagandists connected to GRU, so the military intelligence arm that deals with external operations. We know that they tried to sow disinformation during the COVID pandemic. In fact, in France, the French intelligence services took a really unprecedented step. They came out and said that operatives linked to the Russian state were trying to pay off bloggers to cast doubt on the efficacy of vaccines, particularly the Pfizer vaccine, which is what was at issue at the time. Right, so we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want to. Russian propaganda seems in the West to be throwing a lot of stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. It seems to be geared towards sowing dissent, not necessarily advancing a particular policy line. But what I want to talk to you again is more of how this applies to foreign policy directly. All right, you may be saying, well, okay, you're talking about civilizational issues, you're talking about values, you heard Professor Tumarkin talk a little bit about this already. Does Putin actually believe this? And my answer is, I have no idea. The fact of the matter is, when Putin came to power in 2000, crude oil was coming off a low of $10 a barrel. A decade later, a little bit less than a decade later, crude oil hit a high of about $150 a barrel. Boris Nemtsov, a famous Russian dissident who was gunned down some time ago now outside of the Kremlin, wrote an article at the time calling Putin the luckiest man alive. And what he meant was that Putin really came to power on the back of hydrocarbon exports. This was the tacit deal that was struck with the Russian public, that you stay out of politics and we'll improve your state of living. Anyone who spent time in Russia in the 1990s or even early 2000s understands why this could be potentially an attractive deal to take. But the fact of the matter is, by the time that Putin had come in for his third non-consecutive term in 2012, that deal was falling apart. In 2013, hydrocarbon exports made up 68% of Russia's export GDP. Who knows what happened soon after that? Oil prices went down. In fact, they went negative for a time. Oil producers, oil refiners had to pay storage facilities to take their product. So you could say that Putin is doing this instrumentally because he's looking about for something to rally the Russian population around. It's a case of political prestidigitation, meaning don't look here, our economy's not doing so great, look here instead. It's all about those horrible Westerners and gay Europa, as they like to call it, and their kind of enervated hedonistic ways. or you can think that he's a true believer. Certainly some people around him seem to be true believers. One of the key figures would be Nikolai Patrushev, who was just until recently, when he was replaced with Sergei Shoigu, the head of the security services in Russia. He's now listed as a presidential advisor. I mean, but Patrushev has some wild ideas, including he seems to have never met a conspiracy theory he didn't like. He's probably the one who brought down Prigozhin's plane, by the way. But he thinks that the US wants to take over Russia because the volcano, the long dormant extinct supervolcano around Yellowstone Park in the United States is going to explode, and US leaders know this and want basically Lebensraum. They want a place to be able to move to. So this gives you some idea of the kind of theories we're dealing with here. All right, I have to move along a little. Maps, I like maps. So this is a map of what was talked about as Nova Rossiya, after the breakaway republics of, not recognized by anyone really, Lugansk and Donetsk were formed in the wake of Crimea's annexation in 2014. Appeals to historical justifications for taking over Ukraine have a long history in Putin's Russia. Some of you may have seen the interview that Putin, well, it wasn't really an interview, it was more Putin lecturing Tucker Carlson for a very long time, but what happened in February of this year, some of you may have seen that. I absolutely love the, I could say more of this. There actually are some very interesting political distinctions here, including, I will just mention this quickly. This area is more, or was more, it's changed, but before 2014, more Russophilic. In part, that was because this was the area most affected by the Holodomor, the 1932-1933 famine, where some 3.5 million, maybe 4 million Ukrainians died, and it was repopulated largely with ethnic Russians. We could talk more about that, but this is a tweet I absolutely love. This was tweeted after the Tucker Carlson interview by the former president and prime minister of Mongolia. You see what's funny about it? He's saying, hey guys, you like maps? Let me show you a map. But don't worry, we're a peaceful and free nation. Maps can lie, is what I'm trying to say. This is a more recent quote from 2021 by Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister. Again, very much stressing this kind of idea that Russia is being backed into a corner by the West. This is still when they were on their neo-Nazi kick. Nina's absolutely, Professor Tumarkin's absolutely right. They backed off from that, in part because Russia actually has genuine neo-Nazis fighting in Ukraine. The guy who died with Prigozhin on that airplane in August of last year, Dmitry Utkin, he was actually Wagner. That was his call sign. And that's what the group was named after. He was a confirmed neo-Nazi. He had neo-Nazi symbols, including the SS Thunderbolts, tattooed on his neck. So, again, what we're seeing here is a securitization of civilizational concerns. Now, one thing I find absolutely fascinating is, oh, what happened to my dates? My dates disappeared. I'm so sorry about this. Somehow, well, anyway, should have had dates on here. This is the latest national security strategy. This is from 2021, and this goes back into the 1990s. I'm really not sure what happened there, I apologize. But the current national security strategy is fascinating because it has a whole section devoted to how to protect Russia's traditional spiritual moral values. I don't know of any other single security strategy of any country that devotes this much time to ideas, not to hard concerns, not to concerns about borders, not to concerns about military power. But the point of showing you this is I did a context analysis of the last 5 security strategies. And again, the end here is the 2021 one, where I looked at what concepts were mentioned most often. So I took the top 20 concepts that were mentioned in each of these strategies, and you see this really interesting progression from the late 1990s into the 2000s, you see culture starting to be mentioned, and then you see culture and spirituality, religion mentioned. And then in the latest, spirituality, religion, tradition, values, and culture is mentioned quite a bit. I could probably skip over this, but this is one very good example. I mean, as Professor Tumarkin mentioned, the church has been very, very active in essentially helping Putin establish his idea of a civilizational conflict. In fact, the current patriarch of the church, Kirill Gundaev is his secular surname, he was one of the architects of this civilizational strategy back in the 1990s. It was not the government that developed it, it was the church leadership, along with conservative Russian intellectuals that identified this. The patriarch, I'll just quickly mention this because I'm running out of time, but the patriarch went from fully distancing himself from Putin to embracing this ideology and the goals of the regime wholeheartedly. So for one example, in 2014, when the annexation of Crimea was announced in March in St. George's Hall of the Kremlin, the patriarch was not there. This was widely remarked upon. The 3 Crimean dioceses that were part of the Ukrainian church under Moscow were not transferred to the Metropolitan Patriarch's direct control until 2022. However, more recently, in September of 2022, Kirill said after the partial mobilization was announced that anyone who dies fighting in Ukraine will be cleansed of their sins. Right? So big shift there. This is, by the way, the cathedral of the main cathedral of the armed forces. This is the outside view. Professor Tumarkin showed you the inside view. It is rife with symbolism, including there's no other Orthodox cathedral or church known to me that is painted kind of an army khaki green color. This was one of the more controversial images. This has, I haven't been there personally, but this has apparently been removed, but one of the early mosaics had a banner of Stalin in a church. It's kind of wild, if you think about it. All right, finishing up. This is the latest foreign policy concept. The latest foreign policy concept from 2023 also focuses heavily on civilizational issues. But here I want to highlight the geographic alteration of priorities that it espouses. So we go from the first geographic priority being the Commonwealth of Independent States all throughout the prior 4 iterations through 2016. 2023, it's the near abroad. Interestingly, do you know how many times Ukraine is mentioned? Take a guess. 1. Once. It's not quite 0, but only obliquely as an example of how the West is using proxies to harm Russia's interests. The Arctic becomes prominent. Again, well, now that NATO's border extends well into the Arctic, this is becoming a problem for second strike capability. Not quite sure what's going on here, but this is the first mention of Antarctica ever in a foreign policy concept. All right, let me end with this. So this is the ill-fated attempted mutiny, or whatever it was, in June of 2023 by Prigozhin and Wagner. This is 2 months later. It wasn't a plane crash, it was a plane explosion. But the assassination that was orchestrated by the looks of it by Patrushev. I want to end with this. Right now, Putin has announced that he wants to increase the number of men in the military by 180,000 by the end of this year, so by December of 2024. He wants to get the total strength of troops, active troops under arms, to 1.5 million. Will he be able to pull this off? Well, the very fact that these guys faced basically no resistance, or very little resistance, essentially going up one of the main highways into Moscow, shows that there are some real issues with the Russian military. There's a lot of issues with morale. There's terrible issues with lack of provisions. Conscripts are still having to buy a lot of their own equipment. A lot of what was there was stolen and sold off by their commanders. So the question becomes, well, how successful will he be able to be in this goal? Russia is really focused on hiring what they call the kontraktniki, the contract soldiers. The payments given to them are huge by Russian standards. The basic sign-up bonus right now is $4,600, and then they make a very good salary by Russian standards. In Moscow, the sign-up bonus has been raised to 22,000 US dollars, by the way, by a recent decree of the Moscow mayor. But the question is, how long can this last? Also, I should add, coffin payments, meaning payments for dead soldiers, are also very, very high in Russia, and it's inspired a whole host of tasteless memes. Like, you send your son off and he comes back dead, but you get to buy a new car. But the point is, what will be the ability of Russia to hit this goal of 1.5 million men under arms if they have to announce a general mobilization, if they can't do it with contract soldiers alone? And I think, I'm going to end on a pessimistic note, but if you support Ukraine, this may be a good pessimism. I think they're going to have a huge number of problems with this. And I just want to show you one slide. This is a survey that I did with two co-authors of mine. We looked at Russians who left, specifically in Armenia and Georgia in 2022, so right after the war. You see a huge jump up here in September of 2022, people leaving for Armenia and Georgia. Why do you think it was higher in Georgia, by the way? Any ideas? Think about borders. Georgia has a land border with Russia. Flights into Armenia got very expensive very fast. This was mostly young men, right? So this suggests that if another general mobilization is called up, it may not be all that easy to achieve this target of 1.5 million men. A lot of people, it looks like, will use whatever means they have to leave. I will tell you one thing though, and this I found very interesting. We found this in the survey results. A lot of the men who left, young men who left, still supported Putin when we asked. They still supported the regime. They didn't want to be the cannon fodder, but they still supported the aims of the regime and this idea of protecting Russian civilization. Anyway, thank you very much. I appreciate you listening. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Professor Soroka. I'd like to invite our panelists to come up to the table and now open up this forum to questions from the audience.
Hi, this question is for all three panelists. Do you think that Putin's use of like building up the nuclear arsenal, do you think that's mainly a bluff, or do you see it as a real threat to Ukraine and to the United States?
I wish I knew. I mean, honestly, I think that's really hard. I think Putin has declared a number of red lines and hasn't enforced them. But that said, I also didn't think he would go into Ukraine. So I think no one really knows. This is like the question everyone is worried about right now. I'm sorry I can't give you a more definitive answer, but
It's okay.
that's the
I can't
honest
either.
one.
Can you?
Another roundtable question. What do you hear about the popular response to Navalny's death inside Russia? You spoke about it a little bit, but just interested across the table.
Well, I can start. Navalny was very much admired and very popular. When flowers were brought, the authorities kept taking them away, and yet people would come and flowers would pile up. They didn't even want him to have a public funeral. They just wanted to bury him in the penal colony where he died. Finally, there was a funeral. It was sort of private, but I think his memory is really being invoked. I actually think that we have a person in the audience who can answer this question better than any of us, and that would be Anya Titley. You've been working for Navalny's organization, haven't you? Yeah, you want to give her the mic?
Would you like to answer the question?
What was the question again?
Just about the way in which Navalny is remembered
His
and
legacy.
legacy of Navalny in today. Do you,
Yeah.
I
I'm
guess
not gonna
I
force you to
I
talk.
can just say a few things.
Okay.
But you need to, yeah.
I'm not an expert by any means.
Just especially in the emigre population, there's a strong activist community that's active. There was recently a concert on Navalny's birthday in Berlin that was very well attended, and it was just a very strong feeling of anti-Putin, anti-war, and hope for the future. So there is a lot more of that, I think, among, at least outwardly, visibly among emigres than you might see inside, for maybe for reasons of fear of repression more than true feelings. But it's hard to tell also with polling and lack of accurate information.
Thank you.
This is a question for Professor Hodge. Recently, and since like the war started, there's been a lot of news about Russian musicians, in particular, losing opportunities in orchestras, losing performance opportunities, and all that. Some expressed regret that music has to be so politicized, and others feel like it's a valid and necessary demonstration against Russian policies. And I was wondering how you viewed this dichotomy.
Yeah, how I personally feel about it. I mean, look, Russian musicians have been put into a torturous position by the regime itself, because back when times were a little more peaceful and the war was not going on, Putin and his regime was very careful to sort of groom and cultivate and sponsor and reward and act as a sort of beneficent grandfather to many musicians, artists of various kinds, writers, etc. It's not just the arts; it's the literary scene as well. So and that's all fine, and you know, and there are photographs of all of these musicians receiving a special award from Mr. Putin, People's Artist of the Russian Federation, for example, among the really good ones. You take that award and you think, okay, this is good for my career, I'm so glad, but now comes the time when Putin is going to continue to exploit you, because now you're on the hook. And so some of those people that I was showing you pictures of at the beginning, who are kind of pro-Putin musicians, it's time for them to pay the bill, and they understand that that's what's happening, that they can't now be seen to sort of turn away from Putin. The most agonizing example of this is the aforementioned soprano Anna Netrebko. She just has been unable to sort of say, I am against Putin, I do not support him. She can't say that. I mean, she has kind of danced around the issue many times. So I'll just say that, you know, the Russian regime, going back into the 19th century, certainly the Soviet regime, was very savvy about exploiting artists, musicians, writers as tools of state propaganda. That's continuing into the present. And so you're just in a really tough position in a way that, let's say, Western musicians are not. I mean, if you want to speak out about something as a Western musician, you may upset some of the corporate sponsors and some of the orchestras you might play with, but that's it. The stakes are way higher for Russian musicians.
Did you say that's true for academics as well?
Yes, I would say it's true for academics. For example, Ivan Kurila, who is a friend of ours,
Kind of to piggyback off of Kimmy's question for Professor Hodge, you've talked a lot about living musicians and how that's affected them. But, you know, past artists, composers who in their lifetimes maybe weren't the fondest of the Russian regime, but have since been kind of turned into artistic heroes and like emblems of Russian culture, like composers like Rachmaninoff, Stravinsky, even Shostakovich, who've like today really been glorified by the Russian regime. How does that change how we in the West listen to, perform, analyze this works, or does that change it at all?
This is a great question. I don't have an excellent answer. It's complicated. Politics has always played a role in the lives of the people who make the music, both the composers and the musicians who play the music. It's also played a role in the way we receive and consume that music. And it, of all the sort of bodies of national music that I know of, none exists in less of a vacuum than the Russian national tradition. And it is true that musicians, you mentioned a couple of composers, people like Stravinsky, people like Rachmaninoff, who got out of the Soviet Union in the early days. There are some who were out and then went back in, like Prokofiev. But it's also true that musician after musician after musician, ballet dancer after ballet dancer, opera singer after opera singer in the mid to late 20th century got out of the Soviet Union. There are many famous examples, and came and danced and played in the West. These, I think, well, there are many motivations driving such people, and I would say one overriding one, maybe the most important one, is to flee being used as a tool of a regime that you do not support. So you just extract yourself from that predicament if you could.
This is a question for anybody, but how do you foresee a Trump or a Harris presidency changing the current state of the war?
I'll let you guys take that.
Well, let's start with the 45th president, the former president. I think the news has got to be very bad. I understand that yesterday, Mr. Trump talked about Napoleon and how Russia has a war machine that could never be beat. And he referred to World War II when he referred to Napoleon, and the Kremlin responded that he was really thrilled with that answer. Of course, the concern is that he was, as you probably know, in the debate, he was not willing to say that he hopes that Ukraine will prevail, that he hopes that Ukraine will win the war, will prevail in the war. So there's every indication that he would not want to support Ukraine with the level of funding that it would need to be able to fight. I mean, without Western funding, Ukraine really can't pursue this war. Right? In terms of Kamala Harris, it's not clear, but it does sound as though she would probably continue President Biden's policy of supporting Ukraine. But also the question is, will she go with President Biden's stance up till now, which is that he is very cautious about escalating our help to the extent that the U.S. would really find itself in a war with Russia. So,
I agree with that
Yeah.
wholeheartedly. I would just add that I think the view from the allies is one of disquietude. There's a lot of worry about Trump because he's seen as a very mercurial figure. They just don't know what to expect. And NATO, for all intents and purposes, is still very much a US-led organization. And if that leadership isn't there, the collective will, I think, will soon falter, because Poland, the kind of frontline NATO states facing Russia, facing Ukraine, are very much going to keep pushing. But what will other states do? Because, frankly, we have the polling that shows a lot of the publics in these states are, well, before the war, were not all that enamored of NATO. We have polling that shows in Germany and France, young people would not be willing to fight for NATO. Many of them wouldn't even be willing to fight for their own country. And then you also have a lot of compassion fatigue starting to set in places like Poland and Germany, maybe to some extent understandable, but the right in these countries is playing this up. There's so many memes in Poland right now about like how Ukrainians are cutting in line to get government services. So anything that kind of puts the future of the alliance in doubt even a little bit, I think is quite dangerous, because it's not just what will the US do, it's how will what the US does or doesn't do be perceived by the allies, and what will this mean for a collective response.
Right, and the German far right actually actively supports Putin, the Russia in this war. Yeah.
So this can be a question for anyone, but so as we talked a lot about like kind of the superstructure of geopolitics, I was wondering for like the narratives of the people specifically in Russia, because of the veil of speech control, because of the difference in like the platform usage, how do we study, say, activism in Russia, or how from a scholarly way do we approach like what do people think in Russia?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, and there are some people many people are very skeptical about being able to believe any polling data. I mean, no matter what, polls do not tell you what people think. They tell you what people say. And so the relationship between what they say and what they think is actually pretty impossible to gauge. But I'm very supportive of a polling agency called the Nevada Polling Agency, which works. These are really professional sociologists who work with focus groups and have their ways of asking questions in which they think that the margin of error is not that great. But we just have to use our best judgment. There are some people who say you can't believe any reports, and there are others who say, like I do, that they still do have some value. Where you stand on it.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think they still have a lot of value, but Nevada's, as you all know, been declared a foreign agent.
I know.
So it becomes problematic.
All of our friends are foreign agents.
All of our friends are foreign agents. It also becomes problematic from a practical standpoint that like my IRB won't let us do research in Russia, won't let us use university money to do that research. So it's a practical consideration. There's also this more normative consideration I think you're asking about, but it's very fraught right now.
And I'll just add, as somebody I'm not a social scientist, so how do I gauge what people are thinking in Russia? Well, in the old days, it was by emailing back and forth with my friends in Russia. But you know what I haven't been able to do since February of 2022, and that is email back and forth with my friends. We no longer communicate because it's not safe. It's being monitored. I don't want to get them in trouble. So I can't ask them questions like this. It's really frustrating.
How do most people, other than the television, get their information? Are there not newspapers?
Yes, they're newspapers. Yeah.
Are they not read? What about Voice of America? Does that still exist?
RFE-RL?
Yeah.
Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
And Voice of America.
And Voice of America.
And the BBC.
And the internet exists, and all these things are on the internet, and for the most part, Russians have access to it.
And what about American culture of music and movies and dance?
You know, I don't know what's been going on the last few years with regard to that. I mean, it used to be, the last 20 years or so, those things were very popular in Russia.
Right.
And Hollywood films would always show up there. I don't, Adam, do you have a sense of like what's okay for Russian theaters to show, for example, just movies? I just don't have a sense anymore.
I really
don't know.
But we do have a question back here.
Hi everyone. This is also a question for any of the panelists. I was just wondering how the 85% approval or Putin approval rating can coexist with I'm just looking at a Washington Post article from 2016 that a majority of Russians considered the Soviet Union to be like the height of, I don't know, Russian civilization, or that there was like, that there's this kind of nostalgia for the Soviet Union. I'm just wondering how those two poles can coexist at the same time.
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, in a very real way, Putin, Putin's allowed, as one historian once put it, Soviet nostalgia to be used now to season to taste. Meaning, if you loved Stalin, you can be a Stalin supporter. If you didn't like Stalin, but you thought it was great to be a great superpower, that's fine. Putin is someone who is not against the Soviet Union. He, in fact, as you may know, called its fall the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Not World War II, not the Holocaust, not any horrible thing that happened. It was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So, I don't think there's really that much of a tension there. And I don't think he's trying to recreate the footprint of the Soviet Union. I don't think he has much use for, say, Central Asia. But I think he is trying to recreate some kind of neo-imperial Eastern Slavic core, because he fully realizes Russia can never be an empire without Ukraine in particular, but also Belarus, so basically the Eastern Slavic states.
I think that I don't see that much of a contradiction either, actually. I mean, I think, first of all, when people think about sort of what was the greatest event of the 20th century, they say the victory in the Great Patriotic War, bar none. But the nostalgia is not for the time of Stalin, who was, was leader of the country at the time. The nostalgia is for the Brezhnev regime, when prices were low, when life seemed, when there wasn't such a huge gap between the rich and the poor. I mean, there was, but it wasn't obvious. I mean, the gap between rich and poor in Russia is one of the greatest in any European country. So I think the idea of kind of things were more fair then, I think that's what we're looking at.
It's also, let me just quickly add, that the polling shows that the nostalgia is high among young people. So people who never actually lived in the Soviet Union. Right? It's kind of harkening back to a golden age that they never experienced.
Right, their parents talked about. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question on Russia's foreign policy. At the beginning of the war, Russia was very reliant on Iranian drones. Now that the situation in the Middle East has escalated and Iran is potentially being pulled further into that conflict, does that make them an unreliable supplier of weapons for the Russian army? And if so, does that change Russia's calculations on how they are going to conduct their operations in Ukraine?
Well, I think Russia's, Iran was never, as a supplier, was never a long-term solution. I think Russia's bringing so much of the production back home and looking to do that in a very concerted fashion. But they're also talking to other potential providers, including North Korea, which has provided some military material for them. Will this have an immediate impact? I mean, I don't know the Iranian drone industry well enough to say with any certainty, but I can tell you that a lot of the military production is being brought back into Russia and being really ramped up into Russia. I mean, Russia has really gone on a war footing, particularly under this new Minister of Defense, which seems to have been his entire portfolio after Shoigu was removed and Belousov was put in, to essentially militarize the economy, if you will, to get production up, particularly in the regions.
Hi, I had a question regarding the relationship between North Korea and Russia. In North Korea, a lot of prisoners are sent into Russian camps, and they have their own North Korean camps in Russia, vice versa. And I wanted to know if you guys knew anything about the relationship now currently in the Ukrainian war, and if there is any evidence of them talking or any evidence regarding prison camps and all that sort of stuff.
sorry.
None of us can answer it. Sorry.
Okay.
Or you can pass it forward.
I have a question about the general mobilizations, if anyone who can answer it. So we've been talking about how they're really struggling to get people to want to fight in Russia, and whether or not there's a question that they'll do another general mobilization. And specifically, like, mobilization for men, do you think they would ever attempt to mobilize young women in the country, or is that a line they're not willing to cross? I know the Kremlin has been really, like, building up traditional family values and stuff like that and talking about women's place in society. Is that something they would rather lose the war in theory rather than mobilize women as soldiers?
No, they wouldn't rather lose the war than do anything. I'm sorry, but that's what I think. I mean, 800,000 women served in the Great Patriotic War. So there certainly is a precedent. But at the moment, the mobilization is the bedeviled question, I think, for Putin, because they really need it, but it's so risky. The other one led to such panic and lack of popularity that it's just unclear what they can do about it. I think they're really stuck. And I think actually then mobilizing women, I think maybe if they would recruit women, that might be a more gradual way to do it, rather than calling up, 500,000 Russian women.
Yeah, that might possibly work. Also, the age of marriage in Russia and age of childbearing, even though Russia is in a net deficit in terms of population growth, is so much younger than in most of the West. This would lead to a lot of disparities because a lot of people your age already are married and have children in Russia. One thing that worries me is, the statistics right now, and I think these are believable because these are pre-invasion. The way that conscripts are treated in the Russian military is horrific. And there's been, at least publicly, a big move to do something about this. Not much has been done in reality. Among the all-male army, the estimates are 5% experience rate. So can you imagine what would happen if women were introduced into this mix? Thank you.
I'll get to you in a second, sir.
I have a question for the panel as a whole. What's your take on Russia's supply of hydrocarbons and how that will affect prices and, as a consequence, the Russian economy in maybe, let's say, the next 30 or 50 years, like the mid-long term?
I can answer that. Russia is banking very much on hydrocarbons. Russia has incredible projects being built out right now in the Arctic, for instance. Among other places, and a number of pipeline projects going to Asia and elsewhere. This is going to be the heart of what supports and has been supporting the war effort, and also the willingness of countries, particularly China, but also India and some other states, to buy these hydrocarbons. I mean, Russia's been selling them at cut rate prices, but Russia seems to be basically seeing its near to midterm future based on hydrocarbons. John McCain, the late senator from Arizona, called Russia a gas station with nukes. And this caused great offense in the Kremlin, but he wasn't that far off. For all that Russia talks about developing a high-tech industry, that hasn't gone anywhere. It's still going to be very reliant on hydrocarbons for a very long time.
You had your hand up?
No, I didn't. Sorry.
No, but there was
Hi, this is just for the whole panel. Due to Russian aggression, border countries and its people are afraid of what comes if Ukraine falls, or just even in the coming years. Do you think this fear is justified, and do you see a potential next victim to Russian aggression?
I personally think it is justified, but I think the larger question is whether it's justified or not. The as-if scenario is already guiding politics in the Baltics, in Poland, places like this. So it's already having that impact. It's already leading to the rise of more nationalist parties. And it's having, from my perspective, very unfortunate consequences for Russian-speaking minorities in those countries. So, you know, it's could be a self-fulfilling prophecy in that regard, I think.
I guess I'm less pessimistic. I just think it's so crazy to go and attack a NATO country. But then I thought it would be crazy to invade Ukraine, so there you go.
Hi, I'd like to get back briefly to the historical narrative. So I guess this is more a question for Professor Tumarkin, but also Professor Soroka. On one of your slides you had the background is, you know, the Victory Day thing. And so I was wondering, we've talked about the narrative changing slightly. And so you mentioned less emphasis maybe on this idea of ridding Ukraine of Nazism. What has that change in narrative looked like? Is there still as much evocation of the Great Patriotic War? What might we see on May 9th, the 80th anniversary, very soon, this May? Yeah, how has that changed and what is it now?
Right, I mean, I think there are still references to the Great Patriotic War. There's still references to the victory. You know, we have never been defeated. We will win. We must win. Russia is invincible. It's shown itself to be invincible. But there is less, talk about regime. About Nazis sitting in Kiev, and then Zelensky. I mean, the whole thing. Zelensky, a Jew, is a Nazi. Was obviously it's all preposterous to begin with. But the rhetoric has just so ramped up to talk about how the West is out to destroy us. First of all, the West was out to weaken us, and now the West is out to destroy us.
But can I just add something to that? I think it's not just about we were so strong. We were so good at I will never forget. There was an interview before the March law prohibiting talking about this came down, so right after the invasion. There was an interview on Channel 1 in Moscow of a woman, and she was asked, well, what do you think is going on in Ukraine? People say we're not doing the right thing. Her response, I will never forget, she said, we won in World War II. We were the good guys. How could we possibly be the aggressors now? And I think these years of propaganda and these years of sort of inculcating this idea of we are not just strong, but we're good, has really had an impact in what we see today in Ukraine. People have trouble reconciling this kind of
That's the American narrative about us in World War II as well.
Of course.
We were good. And then we went into Vietnam.
This might be the last question.
Hi. I have a question about Russia's relationship with India. We know that Modi visited Moscow, I believe, a few months ago, but also last year he was in America, at the White House. And I was just wondering if you think, the U.S. elections results this year will have an impact on whether India sides more with Russia or the U.S. in, global conflicts.
Sure. I mean, I'm certainly not a specialist in South Asia, but, India has always maintained this pride in being a largely unaligned state going back into the middle of the 20th century. I think India is going to play both sides of one another as much as possible. India has its own interests. The United States has problems with Modi and the BJP because of its human rights record, particularly the Hindu nationalism and the way they're treating Muslims right now. Russia has less of an issue with this, let's put it this way. As I mentioned, a huge part of Russia's appeal is to this setting up of a multipolar world where it will be one of the poles, and it's saying to India, you can be one of the poles as well. So this, in some way, is very attractive. The question is, India as a developing economy, where is it going to sell its goods to? And that's always going to be the West. So I think that will always be kind of a process that attenuates any furtherance of ties between Russia and India specifically. And India is also concerned about China and Russia's relationship to China. Keep that in mind.
We have one final question.
Hi, this is a question mostly for Professor Soroka about more about the role of the Moscow Patriarchate in influencing any public views on the war, and also the figure of Kirill is confusing to me because there's been so much evidence of his corruption and also his past as a KGB agent, and so what's your take on him still as an influential figure in Russian society?
I don't think he's a tremendously influential figure. I mean, the KGB, you know, it's hard to say. They were all implicated. When the archives were opened, there was a Russian priest who later became a Duma member by the name of Gleb Yakunin, who went into the archives and he made photocopies of a lot of things, and then they were closed. And I talked to him, and he basically said that everyone at a high leadership role was implicated. But whether that means they were active agents or they were just called in, and you know, Professor Tumarkin wrote up a report because she didn't want to get in trouble, so she called me in because I happen to be a clergyman. It's hard to say. Kirill, remember, he was widely viewed as, sorry to put him in that position, he was widely viewed as a liberal throughout much of the 1990s and into the 2000s. He was viewed as more liberal than Alexei, who was his predecessor, when he took over the patriarchal throne in 2009. But the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, and I'm confident in saying this, has a lot of civilizational importance. In other words, people culturally identify as being Orthodox. I mean, do you have friends that like celebrate Christmas but don't go to church, or celebrate Hanukkah but don't go to temple, right? That's kind of the same dynamic. Regular church attendance is still in single digits in Russia, which is kind of funny when Russians talk about, well, America is such a godless society. Americans go to church at rates 5-6 times higher than Russians go to church. So I don't think Kirill, aside from being a figurehead, is very influential. But it does allow Putin to tap into this idea of legitimacy. A large part, in my view, of what Putin's tried to do is he's tried to create this uninterrupted historical arc, that the Soviet Union wasn't like out of time, it wasn't some aberration, it was part of Russia's trajectory. And think about what is the one uninterrupted institution that's existed for so much of Russian history, and that's the Russian Orthodox Church. So that legitimacy potentially is very useful to the regime, or they think it's very useful to the regime. Kirill is a weird guy. He likes to ski, he likes luxury items. We have photographs of him on super yachts hanging out. You really don't want to see a patriarch in a Speedo, but there you go. It exists. It looks like, you know, for Bolotnaya, the protest in late 2011, it looks like he actually did want to go out and back the supporters for a time. But then remember what happened soon after that. He had that controversy with the very expensive watch, and it was photoshopped out. I don't know. I mean, I've heard a lot of rumors from people who know more about this than I do, that basically he was told, you know, mind your place, because we can make life difficult for you. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I find it interesting, his arc. So as I said, in 2014, he wasn't at the declaration of Crimea's annexation. He kind of took a step back. He said that this brotherly war is a tragedy all around, but by 2022, I mean, he was full-scale pro-Putin. So whether that's a genuine evolution or not, I don't know, but I don't think the church is all that influential. Ukraine has always been much more religious than Russia, and part of the reason this Moscow Patriarchate wants to keep control of Ukraine is because there's a lot of valuable real estate associated with church properties in Ukraine. Okay, so what I'm getting at is there are a lot of moving pieces here. It's not just about religion and holiness, but there's some very practical concerns as well.
Thanks.
Well, students, we're going to wrap up here. Thank you for your amazing, intelligent questions, all of you. There were a lot of them. And join me in a round of applause for our panelists.